Hi, I'm Ryan.
Hey, I'm Jess, and this is Your Therapist is Not Okay.
On today's episode, we're going to answer the question, have I triggered my therapist?
But before we get started, we really wanted to give a heartfelt thank you to everyone who liked, commented, subscribed, and even reviewed our podcast so far. We've only been out for a week. And hearing your feedback and just knowing that this is resonating with our listeners has been so impactful for us. So if you haven't liked or subscribed yet to the listening platform you have, please go ahead and do that right now. That way we can reach more people, beat the algorithm, and hopefully be able to start really impacting, breaking the stigma on mental health.
Our question for today's episode comes from our producer, Denise. She brought us this question because of an episode from another podcast. So we're going to dive in and share our thoughts with you.
So, Jess, let's answer Denise's question. Do therapists get triggered by their clients?
Yeah, I think they can. I don't think it's common, but it definitely can happen. So Denise was listening to a podcast herself, a different one, and in it, one of the therapists was disclosing that she got triggered by a client who didn't know how to handle their um, kid kind of exploring sexuality and gender. And the therapist was saying how hard that was for her and that she was quite emotional in the session because I guess the therapist had gone through that.
Right.
And so that was kind of the context that Denise was bringing. And it did get me thinking that, yeah, almost as we were talking about in our last episode, we often come to this field because we have had trauma in our past. We've either gone to therapy ourselves and found it helpful, or that we've had things that we've dealt with, like depression or anxiety or other life events. And so we're not perfect, we're not fixed, we're not solved. So sometimes, yeah, I could see that if a client's bringing something that's pretty close to home, or like what Denise was saying, if a client that's quite antagonistic of something that they've gone through, it could be familial abuse that the client might be hearing again and maybe gone through um, that ourselves as therapists in our past. All of these things can definitely start to almost, as we're listening, remind us of what we've gone through. And if it's severe enough, that can be a trigger, I would say.
hmm Yeah, and I guess I do also recognize that there's a possibility that vicarious trauma could play a role here too, where if we've been inundated with a certain kind of concern in our work, which happens just by coincidence sometimes that everybody comes with a similar issue.
Mm,
Or maybe we've worked with the client in the past that it brought up a lot of challenges.
mm,
Maybe times that we're concerned for our clients. So I
mm.
can also see a way in which we might be triggered directly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So not just the past, but also actually like as we're working, we might actually get inundated with this kind of like with the story, and that can actually hurt us as well. We have a lot to take on as we're holding someone else's story.
Yeah. Yeah. But I would kind of say that, of course, therapists can get triggered. My hope would be
Hmm.
that the client would never know that.
Oh, say more.
In order to hold the client, we need to be kind of ready to set those things aside
Mm,
enough that we can continue to be there for the client and support the client through the session. And then after the session,
mm,
take care of ourselves.
absolutely.
There are certainly like little micro skills and techniques that we might use throughout a session
Hmm.
if we're struggling. Um, Even little somatic things like tapping on our knees,
Hmm.
pushing our feet into the floor, even just doing some slow breathing. Um, Actually, it's interesting that there are times when I've invited a client to do a grounding activity,
Hmm.
and it's as much for me, it's for them, if not more for me. But I'm like, oh, do you want to do a little box breathing? That's because of me.
I would also like to do that right now.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that like with the supervisees I've had, especially when I was in Edinburgh, when you're first starting out in the field, it can be really difficult to know how much we can handle as well. So we're talking about the word trigger, but I think what that can mean is like either from our past or something that kind of emotionally becomes raw for us
Mhm.
that we don't know if we can handle the work. And I found with new therapists, that can often happen if the story is quite traumatic.
Mhm.
It's, can I handle this? There can be a limit of competency sometimes with hearing a story that might be a lot and wondering if we're capable of
Mhm.
being the helper that we want to be with clients.
Sure. And I've definitely seen that working with trainees as well.
Hmm.
But I think it's really important to note there that not all of that is about experience
Yes.
in what I've witnessed.
Hmm.
That there are some people that from early on in their development as a therapist, they're pretty unflappable, at least outwardly. Um, and whereas I know very seasoned therapists that are very particular about like, actually, that's not something I can work with, which is a really important thing for therapists to recognize that like maybe there are certain things that don't work for me.
Mm,
That I'm not going to be able to be the best therapist for you, which is actually such a responsible and professional thing to do.
mm. Yeah, knowing when to say, I may not be the one for you. I may not be the one that's going to be able to help you through this. Here's some referrals. Here's what I have.
Mm.
Ryan, I'm wondering, thinking about that, what happens if you get activated or triggered in a session by a client, whether it's something that they're bringing that might be heavy, whether it's something that links to your own past?
Mhm.
If that happens, how do you navigate it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So to dig a little bit more into triggers, which you were starting to talk about there, Jess,
Hmm.
like there is we've triggers have kind of become commonplace language,
Hmm.
which it's always cool when mental health things, enter more of the common vernacular, but then they also tend to morph a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So people will often talk about being triggered if they're just experiencing something challenging that like this reminds me of a painful event, etc. And I have no intention of delegitimizing that. That could still be thought of as a trigger.
Mhm.
There's also a way of conceptualizing triggers in which someone enters a trauma response so that they're physiologically kind of back in how their body felt when they experienced a trauma that has some kind of connection to something that just happened.
Hmm.
Um, so the ideally, therapists have had a lot of therapy, whether it's through various groups that they've done while they were learning, through their own individual therapy, so that they are able to see when one of the triggers that takes them out of the moment is coming
Mm.
and utilize those scoping techniques to stay in the moment and stay with the client.
Hmm.
And that just honestly comes from coming up against the trigger many times and learning how to manage it, which is often what we end up supporting our clients to do.
Hmm.
So when I'm noticing that I might have a trigger coming up, and it's interesting, the example that we talked about from a different podcast was about sexuality. Clients do come in with really strong opinions about sexuality, being very supportive of queer folks or being very unsupportive of queer folks. And I have had some very interesting experiences as a queer and non-binary person where someone has been talking about how they don't know how to support their kid,
Yeah.
or someone is talking about how they're not like those other gay people, or talking about how they view me can sometimes be an interesting experience as well.
Oh,
There's some clients that
yeah.
really want me to be a cis man.
Oh.
Um, and for me, that particular one is the easiest thing in the world.
Oh, yeah?
It actually really is. That particular example, I can just take a deep breath and know that someone's opinion of my identity has nothing to do with me. So it just helps me kind of move into this is an insight into how the client's world works. is nothing to do with me. And I don't need, I think sometimes that, not all queer people experience this. I certainly don't speak for all non-binary people. Um, but part of me acknowledging my being non-binary, coming out to the people that I want to come out to includes I don't care what anyone else thinks.
Okay.
Right. Like I don't need to be legitimized.
Especially in the therapy room.
Right. My emotional needs are pretty far out of the room when I'm being a therapist. It's not that we never have them crop up,
Mhm.
and we have to be aware of those when they do, but for the most part, that's kind of out of the room. So it doesn't hit me in as personal a way.
Well, and I think what you're talking about as well is that it's not that you don't care about how they're viewing you, it's that this is something that is now something that can be worked for in the room. You were linking to a term, I think, that we often use as psychodynamic practitioners, and that's transference.
Mhm.
That we may be viewed in a number of ways for a client to actually work with and work through in session with us. And transference can be, you remind me of my son, you remind me of my brother, you remind me of my father, very masculine roles that for a time maybe is important for you to take on
Mhm.
as they kind of work through that response to who you are in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually something that I've always found very delightful.
Mm,
It's not been something that bothered me. There may be times that other folks feel bothered by that.
mm,
A lot of trainees that I've had that were not trained in a modality that kind of honors and celebrates transference
yeah.
tend to be like, oh, I could never deal with a maternal transference. And I'm like, I'm happy to take on brother, dad, mom, grandma is actually my favorite.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's fine. I'm happy to be used in that way. Um,
You have great grandma energy, by the way.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much. It's the shawl. And I'm also like quite happy to be frank with myself.
Yeah.
It's not surprising that someone would project a male figure onto me, right? I have a beard, I have a relatively deep voice, like it's fine.
Hmm.
These are just things that are part of reality. Um, there are maybe more challenging moments when I just have to remind myself I'm gonna put that out of the room and come back to it on my own time later.
Mm,
If it's maybe about a familial dynamic that I've experienced, then those are the ones that would be a little bit more challenging for me.
mm,
What I'm most likely to notice, and clients probably don't notice this, but who knows, is that I might want to fix it. I
mm.
might want to fix it too fast and say like, oh, because I think I know how to manage this. When in reality, that figuring it out, that making decisions of how to do it, that needs to come from the client
Okay.
through my support. But
Mhm.
I do notice there's more of an urgency when it's something that I too
Mm.
wish was fixed in my world.
Yep. Sure. That can bleed in.
Yeah. What about you, Jess? What do you do if you're coming up against a trigger in a session?
I've done a lot of my own personal work. So often when it comes to stories, oh, it's usually me feeling really deeply about the work I'm doing.
Mm.
Specialize in trauma. And I can really feel for a client's story in a way that if we're both meeting each other right in that intimate space and we're talking,
Mhm.
and I can notice my body, especially after all these years of doing it, I can notice when my body wants to cry. I usually honor that with a client. It can be really healing. There's moments while I'll be talking about something really intense that my body doesn't feel the need to cry. It's almost like my body can know when it's appropriate in some weird
Mhm.
way.
Mhm.
I really trust my body in that, and I can be a beautiful thing for us to cry together.
Mm.
So that's kind of about story. But in my career, I have lived through a lot of political and world unrest. I've lived through when I was in Scotland, the referendum.
Mhm.
I was in Scotland during Brexit. I was here, we've had COVID.
Mhm.
There's a lot of political unrest right now. And with wars and fear, it's not uncommon for me to notice that if I can use COVID as the example, I was going through the exact same pandemic
Hmm.
and I had to hold everyone else's stories. And that for me was probably not necessarily what I would call trigger, but I really had to contend with that.
Mm.
That as someone's scared about whether or not they're going to have a job next week, oft I had the exact same feelers
Hmm.
because I was working for myself as a practitioner. And so when they were talking about that, I was like, girl, me too, same in my head. And I thought, how do I again
Right.
allow this to inform my feelings, but not necessarily put any of my own ideas of what a client's going through onto them because this is mine and that's something that they are going through very uniquely for them. And so that's what comes front of mind when I think of this is that kind of aspect of what's mine right now in the world that
Mhm.
I'm kind of thinking about and worried about. What's the client's and how can my fears maybe not get in the way, but inform? And there, like you said with some of your clients about sexuality, for me, if somebody has a very different opinion about politics, that's okay. I remind myself, Jess, your role is not a debater right now. Your role is not to like fight, right? You're not at a cafe with a friend. Your role right now is to meet them in what that means for them as a person. And for me, I find new therapists and trainees often have that. I'll never be able to work with somebody who
Mm.
thinks so differently from me. And I realize for myself, that's not something that really gets in my way in the sense of like, I can't ever work with somebody. But sometimes I'll notice myself do a thing where I'll just tuck my stomach in. I have enough tension, but you can't see it on my face. Where I'll just like kind of like listen and kind of try. This is where it gets complicated. Try to find the meaning in what someone's saying.
Mhm.
That is not necessarily just this opinion or just this thing. It's like, what's the impact underneath of this?
Right. I hear what you're saying, and that kind of uniqueness of the way we think and the way we approach communication with clients in our work that I often find myself, and it bleeds into other parts of my life too, just thinking like, I understand why someone might feel that way.
Hmm.
I don't agree. I think
Hmm.
it's harmful, maybe, particular political things that I might disagree with. And I can also get it.
Yeah.
And that's I think what you're kind of naming, that part of our role to like get it, even if we still think at the end of the day that's not the way I would conduct myself.
I think this is a weird unforeseen benefit of
Mm.
our work is that like when in life do we ever like really listen to things that we adversely disagree with? Like when do we ever have a chance to actually dive into that worldview?
Mm.
I one time heard something that I really loved, and it said, when you underline in books, it's because you agree. It's
Mm.
very rare for us to underline something that we don't agree with. And I was thinking,
Right.
yeah, it's very rare for me to surround myself with opinions that aren't singing in the same choir I am.
Right.
But in this role, I get to.
Hmm.
And in this role, I actually get to learn and think about and grapple with. And is it challenging? Absolutely.
Mm.
But I think that's part of the amazing role we have. We enter someone's life. We are very intimate in that. It matters to both of us. And because everyone's so unique and has their own opinions, it's almost a question of how do I enter into this world to know what the impact of that is? And for me, that's really important. And that had to happen during different opinions, world events. It's how do I get to be there for you right now? And the flip side of that is also how do I care for myself well enough
Mm.
that I can do that for someone else? So for me, this question really brings in an idea of self-care as well.
Strongly agree with that. Yeah.
I know this is a bit of a switch of a question,
Mm.
but I'm really curious about if you would ever tell a client, you said earlier in the podcast that you hope a client would never know.
Mm.
You hope a client would never know you're triggered. But we talked about last time about self-disclosure. Would there ever be a time you might share with a client a personal story, or if this links to your life, would you ever self-disclose?
If it's involving feeling activated or triggered, I would say no,
Okay.
because that's my body just letting me know, actually, you're not ready to talk about this with enough neutrality, that it's not becoming about you. And
Mm,
that is for me kind of the gold standard of self-disclosure, which is it's a very seldom thing for me, self-disclosure.
okay.
Is this for the client's benefit, or is it because I want to share it? It resolves some tension in me,
Hmm.
and that's for me never the reason to do it. Um, there's maybe an element of self-disclosure that I might offer in terms of, can we pause for a second? That's really heavy. I'm noticing how impacted you are by that.
Yeah.
I might self-disclose that I'm hearing the intensity of their story, the
Mm,
depth of the feeling that they're bringing. And that to me is kind of like self-disclosing my emotional process in the here and now
okay.
about the work that we're doing.
Mm,
But I would not, maybe I should edit that a little bit. There are certain elements of self-disclosure that, for me to live authentically, kind of show up. For example, I'm non-binary and my pronouns are on every email that I send.
mm,
They tend to be with my profile at the places that I work,
mm.
so that, it's clear. And that draws clients. Sometimes there's some clients that want to work with a non-binary provider because they share that identity, or there's some sense of maybe safety that comes with that for them. Um, so there are times when I've mentioned to clients like, well, it's interesting you say that, because actually I am non-binary.
Mm.
Um, so there are maybe some select things that I do occasionally self-disclose.
Mhm.
But again, if it's something that's raw and triggering, that's a no for me. That's going to be a hard pass.
Yeah, there's something about even in your body, even in your email, even in what you're wearing, the background, all of that is disclosing something about you.
Yeah.
We're never a blank screen, but you're saying that, like, you know, if there's an emotional response here,
Mhm.
that's information for me. That's maybe not information that I need to share right now because it's more for me if I did than it would be the client.
Yes, exactly.
Hmm.
Or if I want to tell a client something about like my political beliefs, or how it is for me to be non-binary or something, as a almost as like a retort,
Mm.
then we're in very dangerous territory,
Yeah,
right? Then we might be inadvertently, maybe intentionally, shaming or pressuring our clients to change something about their worldview. Then that's not what we do.
yeah, I can see that. It's creating a rupture in a way that, again, it's more for the therapist than it would be for the client.
Right. It's not that that would never ever happen either, right? Like, as we talk about all of this, I'm reminded that, like, therapists are not perfect. We're not in control 1000% of the time.
We make mistakes.
We make mistakes. So when you said rupture, I thought, like, it is totally possible when there's a moment that we kind of miss it,
Hmm.
and maybe a client does catch some of our rawness.
Mm,
Clients are people like anyone else, of course,
yeah.
and they're very perceptive.
Oh, yes.
So we might, because of a trigger that we don't even speak anything about,
They might see it on your
we
face.
might see it on our face, or we might drop them, like our attention or our focus might slip a little bit.
Hmm.
And then that might be something that we acknowledge later.
Yeah.
In the same session or in the next session, we're like, actually, I just want to acknowledge that I think
Mm.
I was a little distracted for a minute, and I don't know if that had some kind of impact on you.
Mm. That would be a good use of self-disclosure in the sense of like, here's where I was at.
Mhm.
Let's talk about that between us. Hmm.
Right. So that the self-disclosure is about the here and now interaction with the client, not the content of my past.
Ryan, there was a time I did self-disclose.
Hmm.
I kind of felt like I had to. Um, in order to not be disingenuous.
Hmm.
I want to share that. A client came and it was uncanny how similar our pasts were,
Hmm.
from the kind of familial trauma that we both had had, very specific grief at the exact same age. And the client kept saying, no one understands. No one gets me. There's no one that's ever lived through what I've lived through.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting there being like, I have. And I had a choice to make.
Mm-hmm.
And the choice was like, do I let them believe that?
Mm-hmm.
Do I let them kind of know that, like, I'm going to be this sage provider? If I don't do it now, I can't do it in 3 sessions, can't do it in 6 months. Like, it's in the room right now. And I really wanted to work with this client. So I wasn't a trigger. I wasn't triggered. I know my past,
Mm-hmm.
but it felt like this really important moment of, do I share myself? I've never done that before. And so what I did do was I said, you do keep saying no one knows what you've been through. No one's been through this. I need to share something with you. Our stories really align. I too have had this loss. I too have had to navigate what it felt like to have basically, I said, the flooring ripped out from under me and felt like I was falling. Remember that feeling? And the client's face lit up
Mm-hmm.
because I was using language that I think that they had never even like heard before. And I said, so I understand. I do, but I'll never know it from your end.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to give this so that I've had that we were pretty aligned in our past. But I need to hear it from you. I need to learn from you. Even if we both have gone through a very similar past, we will have experienced it very differently. And I'm only sharing this so that you're not alone, but this is about you.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt for the very first time, I have never self-disclosed like that since. I probably won't. I can't say ever, but it didn't feel like, it felt like a real position I was in where I could either meet a client right where they were at with self-disclosure, or I could just have it be this thing in the background that I always knew I didn't do.
And hearing you talk about that too, and I've heard you talk about that in the past. Something that stands out is your self-disclosure was so clearly for a specific purpose
Yeah.
to ensure the client that you're not alone,
Mm-hmm.
that I can understand you,
Yeah.
and not to dive into the details of your past.
No.
Right. Like it was, you said enough
Mm-hmm.
to communicate that I get it.
Yeah. Let's go back to you.
Mm-hmm.
It felt really honest. I felt like there was something in it that felt like I'd be disingenuous if I was one more person that didn't get it, or if I was one more person that hadn't lived through this. It is a very, very specific past. And I'm not going to say like it's shortcut trust, but I think me opening up in that way allowed the client to feel seen, because it's quite a vulnerable thing to do, to self-disclose. And I think being able to offer that in first session um, was important. And I think because I had done so much my own work, I knew that I could still work with this client, that it wasn't going to rub up against my past, or
Right.
that I would somehow answer it as if it was me and not listening to them.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, I'd already known that, and I could feel it in myself. And so the self-disclosure really wasn't about um, trying to move a client into my world, but really just allowing myself to just be as honest as I can to move back into theirs.
Mm. And I guess maybe a closing thought that I would offer on that is just to recognize that triggers are reactive, whereas what you did was responsive.
Mm,
You had enough time and space mentally to think about, am I going to do this? Why am I going to do this? And how will it impact the therapy.
Mm,
Whereas if it were different and it was a situation where there was a trigger, then it wouldn't be really controlled
no.
in that sense. It would be just like, "Blah, here's
Yes.
my stuff."
Yeah, exactly. That's such a good point. That when we're triggered, it's a bodily reaction. We get activated. And in this one, it was like, I actually have lived through something that I can offer. And I'm very similar to you. I very seldom self-disclose, knowing that at every moment my face is disclosing something.
Yes,
I
there
am,
are always ways we disclose.
yes,
Our backgrounds, our faces.
my eyebrow always lifts.
I
I,
learned so much when we were in training about my face
yes.
and how actually plain as day my expressions are. I used to think I was very mysterious.
Yes. Um, Advice for new therapists, just because it feels important. If you're feeling triggered, number one thing, hold on to it and use it as information for you. You didn't do anything wrong. This is
Mhm,
just what your body's telling you as information, and take it to supervision. Take it
mhm.
to someone that can hold this, that's been around a while, and allow yourself the space and time and potentially therapy to be able to work through what just happened for you. Um, and think about what our limit of competency is. And what I mean by that is we often use that term to think, is this going to be okay? Can I work with somebody that might be bringing up something that's hitting a bit close to home? And for clients, I have an advice for you. Never fear triggering your therapist. You've been told so many times in your life, probably, that you're too much, or this story's too much, what you're bringing's too much. This is your space. The therapy room is your hour. And if your therapist is triggered, that is on your therapist to navigate, to work through. So many clients get scared that what they're bringing is something we can't handle. And we are trained, and what Ryan and I've been talking about all today is about doing the work to hold you well. I just really wanted you to hear that, clients, that whatever you bring is perfect and you can bring it again and again and again. This is not for you to take care of your therapist. You don't have to do that here.
It's maybe the one space where you don't have to worry about other people at all.
Mm,
So keep it that way.
yeah. Thanks, Denise, for this amazing question.
It was such a good question. And thank you all for tuning in.
See you next time.
If you enjoyed this episode, check out our others. And stay tuned for even more episodes coming up.
Follow us and leave a review on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please tell your friends.
You can also follow us on Instagram too, at Your Therapist Is Not Okay. Also, if you have any questions that you want us to answer, send us a DM there. We would love to answer your questions. And a lot of our topics come from listeners just like you.